in touch with the spirits, the netherworld, and finding out what's going to happen. This was the passion of the ancients, somehow to get a bit of control over the world they lived in. Like people, he says, today believe in the spirits and in the shadim, and even very fine Jews have been known to have believed in shadim. Now, not everybody liked eating blood. Actually, it's not such an attractive thing to eat. Although if you are a shipwrecked sailor and you can't drink seawater, then the next best thing is blood. So you kill a fellow sailor and you drink his blood, and you hope to survive for a few more days. If you're already drinking his blood, then you might as well eat his flesh. This was known as the custom of the sea in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. I see, Shmuley, that you are thinking of the delectable delights of such a diet. It's interesting that Captain Dudley, who was implicated in the famous case of Crown against Dudley and Stevenson, was on his way to Sydney, and although he was found guilty of murder, his sentence was commuted by Queen Victoria. He only served 6 months, and he went off to Sydney again, and he set up a shop for marine supplies. He was well known for his delicious meat pies, and I'm not going to say any more about that. But if you are in Sydney next time, you will find Captain Dudley's shop, okay, in celebration of that 1884 shipwreck and the cannibalism on the high seas. But generally, if we can avoid eating blood, certainly its raw form, we'll do that. Yorkshire puddings is something else. Brian, do you know about Yorkshire puddings?
I think Scottish haggis maybe, but Yorkshire pudding?
Yeah, it's blood pudding.
Black pudding.
I think Hungarian bull's blood wine didn't have any blood in it.
And correct, but Yorkshire pudding did. Bernard Wolfson, do you know about Yorkshire pudding?
No, the black pudding.
Black pudding, exactly.
Pudding.
They called it black pudding, but
Yes,
it's
not
made with blood. Most people don't like blood in the raw. Beginning of line 8, what you did was you slaughtered an animal, you caught its blood in a vessel, or you put it in a ditch in the earth. So like Dudley and Stevens, you eat the meat sitting around, have a nice barbecue around a pool of blood. But the spirits will come and eat the blood, and they, the humans, will be eating the flesh. Everybody's having a good time. Okay, the spirits, think of Dracula, okay, are enjoying their blood, and the humans having a good barbecue. And that's why I talked about Yeshiva and Adam. We're all getting together and having a nice blood barbecue. The spirits will then come to them in a dream and tell them the future, and that will be very helpful. These were prevalent ideas at the time, and they were highly desirable enterprises. Nobody did not believe in them. As I said, think about the legend of Dracula. And vampires, to this day, are a favorite fare on TV and film, of course. These are horrible diseases. Torah fights against them, and therefore it particularly prohibits blood. And it is as strict in relation to blood as it is in relation to idolatry. Now, what hints do we have in the Bible for this practice? Well, we'll look at the book of Vayikra. That phrase, you shall not eat on the blood, doesn't mean eating the blood, but refers to the yeshiva and Adam, sitting around having this meal that was aimed at both humans and spirits. Lo telachashu, then you shall not go in for augury, v'lo ta'onenu, and you shall not go in for divining. All of these things are in Parashat Kedoshim, they're all together. So, blood and augury, divining, spells, charms, hubble bubble, and all that, it's in the same category. Or let's go to Shmuel. They're eating on the blood, the people. Then he asks for a big stone, and he sacrifices on the stone. Shaul says, bring all your animals to me, sacrifice here at the big stone. In other words, during Saul's time, the Israelites were doing that. It's ironic, of course, because Saul, early on, he fights Achila al Adam, and he kills all the witches. When he becomes an obsessed and paranoid monarch, what does he do? Eve of his last battle, to whom does Saul go?
Witch
The
of
witches of
Endor.
Endor. How the mighty have fallen. And it's at the end, when we read about him going to the witch of Endor, that the Tanakh tells us in a very dramatic way, and when he was young, Shaul had killed all the witches, as it says, so there's a drama there. Lachen amar Elohim, this is from Yechezkel, Ko amar Hashem Elohim, al Adam tochelu, why is your temple destroyed, says Yechezkel to the people of Eretz Israel? Because you've been eating on the blood. You've spilt that blood in order to try and find out what's going to happen. And this, of course, is for Maimonides the highest form of idolatry. Ibn Ezra, lo tochlu adam, ki chen katuv hinei ochlim al adam. Shmuel Aleph, ki ilu ochlim zvachim lasirim kasher perashti. That is the offering to the spirits of the wild spirits, as I've explained. Shaya ken min agam mitzrayim mizbach b'shem hashidim, ki achar shelo nizrak adam le'mizbeach l'shem Hashem. The Mishkan then introduced an innovation. We take the blood, it has to be sprinkled by the Kohanim in the Mishkan on the altar. No blood to be used by the regular community. הנה דבר ברור, על כן דבק עמו לא תנחשו, כי במצרים היו אוכלים על אדם וזונים אחרי השדים, ובארץ כנען מנשכים ומעוננים. No places like Egypt and Canaan for this sort of thing. כי כן כתוב, גם זה כמעשה ארץ מצרים וכמעשה ארץ כנען, and they lump together in Parashat Acharei Mot, okay? You shall not follow. And this is part of the Torahitic revolution. Lachen al Adam tochlu, this is Radak on Yechezkel. ואני ציוויתי לכם לא תאכלו על אדם, כי היא עבודת עקום, שהייתה חוק מן הזובחים לשדים שאוכלים סביב אדם, אחר שזבחו להם, וזה דבר הלמד מניינו. לא תאכלו על אדם, לא תנחשו ולא תאוננו. Davar halamed minyano, we say it every morning, the bright of Rabbi Ishmael. We know something from its context. How do we know that the Lo Tignov in the Ten Commandments is kidnapping human beings? Because all the rest of the prohibitions involve capital punishment, murder and idolatry. So therefore, stealing is also stealing a person, a capital crime. So here we know that the blood is to do with nichush, and the lotonenu with auguries and with divining and with all of that jazz. Now Ramban makes an interesting point, and here I think we should pay attention. Ramban says, okay, the prohibition against blood is very serious, and then he goes on to say, line 27, third word from the end, Varav katab b'Moreh Nevukhim, what we've just read. כי היו הכסדים מואסים אדם ויחשבו להם לטומאה, אבל יאכלו ממנו הרוצים להתחבר השדים ולנבא מהם העתידות. It's clear that they wanted to commune with the spirits and get an edge and find out what was happening. It was Rambam's fight is against this disease of people grasping at any straw to be able to predict what's going to happen and somehow protect themselves against the vagaries of nature or violence or war or famine or anything like that. Okay? והתורה תכוון לעולם להרוס בנייני שכלותם בהפוך מחשבותיהם. לקחת האדם באכילה או בחרה בו להתאר בהזעות או לזרקו למזבח לכפרה. Therefore the blood is taken to be an atonement on the altar. Okay? So that's why, that's again a means of weaning Israel from this terrible habit. לקח אמר ונתתי פני בנפש האוכלת את הדם. I mean, God is as angry with a blood consumer with spirits as he is with an idolater. The same phrase, v'natati et panai ba'ish asher ma'avir et beno lamolech, for example. Is that correct, John? Are you still with us?
But I am a little bit lost. From line 15 until line 26, where does it come from?
Line 15 to 26 are bits of Tanakh where we learn about Achila al Hadam.
Donc it's not from the text.
No. You can see I bolded Vayikra, Kedoshim, Shmuel, Yechezkel.
From 26 to
Now
this is Ramban.
We are now reading Ramban. Yes, Nachmanides.
Where is that in Ramban?
You'll see it. We have to go down quite a bit.
Yes.
Yud Zayin, Yud Aleph.
I should, yes.
And I checked it 5 times. It is there. Okay. Now, what's very interesting is that Ramban talks about Noten Zaro Lamolech, line 31, and the same phrase, Natati Panai Baish, who eats blood, is Natati Panai Baish, Hashem Aviret Beno Lamolech, Shehem, okay, Shehu Mevi Lemin Miminei Avodah Zarah. So eating blood is the same category as Avodah Zarah. Ki lo, beginning of line 32, Ne'emar ken b'mitzvah acheret. That phrase, and I'll set my face against him, is only in the mitzvah of Avodah Zarah. Now he says, and I bold of this something very interesting. Ve'elu dvarim miyushavim. Now Ramban Nachmanides, says these things make sense. Now Nachmanides doesn't deny what the Rambam says. Aval haktuvim lo yoruken. But I don't think that the psukim actually say this. Which is, of course, an issue with the entire enterprise of Rambam in the Moreh Nevukhim using psukim to explain things. Perhaps that isn't the whole of what Scripture says. The hechzir b'mishneh Torah rak chazak levutiach kol adam ki adam hu anafesh. Lo tochal hanefesh im avzer. I was to ask you, what's the reason for not eating blood? Given in the Torah, what would you say? The dam is a nefesh. And you can't eat the nefesh when you're eating the flesh, okay? This is a big problem. With something about the Torah says, I don't want you to eat a nefesh. Then Ramban goes on to say, look, it must be like this, that God didn't want us to eat a soul of an animal because in some way or the other, we are similar in our souls to animals. In the beginning, we were only meant to eat fruit, right? But then later on, Noach, in the Teva, okay, Kibyotam bavur hadam. Hinei hitir gufam asher hu chai bavur hadam, she'yeh lanator tzorchei shel adam, she'tiyeh nefesh amen lechaparat adam, okay, b'krevim lefanav yitbarach lo she'yoklu. And then the idea was that we should not eat it, we should sacrifice, say. But because hanafashot kulan na'el, here's a pasuk from Kohelet. Then he says, line number 2, nefesh habeima hi nefesh gemura betzad min hapanim. One can compare our souls to that of the animals. Lachen yishbar da'at livroach min hanezek v'lalechet acharei hanaotla. And therefore we have fight-flight. Animals will respond in a way that looks like beings that have a soul. The heker b'regilim, and they get into habits. And the dogs, don't dogs love their owners? Don't we feel The Maharal, of course, said famously, why Kelev kulo lev? Is all heart, says the Maharal, unlike cats. It's a Gemara in Horiot Daf Yud Gimel explains in his Chidushei Agadot. But, I mean, many people would say a dog is really not only like a person, emotionally and spiritually, but better than a person, right? I love my dog. I don't like people so much. That will not be the first. So, they really know their owners. They can find their way back no matter how far you try and drop them off. They will find their way back. Lassie comes home, or Greyfriars Bobby in Edinburgh. And think about doves. Amazing things, doves. They will fly back, okay? Pigeon mail. How could you imagine that? They must have great souls. And then he goes on to say, then he goes on to say something. He says, look, possibly Ramban is not that convinced that everybody would agree that an animal has a soul. Certainly not a soul like a human being, okay? And a question is whether you'd call it a soul at all, okay? Descartes, by the way, was famous for saying that an animal is just like a clock, okay? No difference. And Solomon Maimon says that, he started to kick around a dog and the dog yelped. And a friend said, why are you so cruel? He said, well, according to Descartes, it has no soul. It's only like a clock, so I'm giving it a bit of a kick. And he found himself being very unpopular. But philosophically speaking, so would the Rambam, would Maimonides go along with Descartes? Probably more than with Nachmanides. I doubt whether fight-flight would be called a soul in any way similar to a human soul. I think that's what Maimonides would probably say. His concept of human soul. So the question is, what does the Rambam do with this this nefesh thing? So he might be saying, well, people might think, or that's what the Sabians used to think, and he'd have to get around it that way. It's not the first time that Maimonides beguiles us into believing that he's giving us the reason for a mitzvah in the Torah, but actually, if you read the Torah carefully, you could read the Torah differently. That's why this is a nice methodological point. Remember, Maimonides has an agenda, and he will give us a lot of scintillating evidence, psukim, verses, but it may be that these are not quite as convincing if you read the whole of the Torah. But Ramban doesn't dismiss Maimonides out of hand. In relation to Korbanot, he does. He says these are divrei Havai, what Maimonides says, but not here. So he too is in two minds. So he gives us his last attempt for the nefesh is interesting. He says, look, when we absorb animal bits, they go into our body and they could have an influence on us at a psychological level. If you go around eating lion meat all your life, you might act like a lion and want to devour others. And then he says also the blood is not mediated by the other organs. He thinks that if you eat a piece of lion meat, you'd have to have it mediated. It'll go into your stomach, then you go into, and then it'll be purified. The liver has a role to play. Everything has a role to play, and you get only a little bit of lion. But the blood goes straight through, so he thought. He's a 13th century. If you drink blood, it goes straight into your bloodstream, and therefore you would easily absorb lion or pig-like qualities. Okay, and that would have. This is, by the way, one of the major reasons given in Orthodox circles, often for the laws of kashrut, that if you eat violent animals, you become a violent person. And Kabbalistically speaking, and it could fly. So this is what the Ramban says. Elsewhere in the Ramban in Dvarim, he also talks about this, and he again says something very similar, only here he has to deal with the relationship between the shedim and eating of blood, and he accepts that. Ramban in Dvarim accepts there's a relationship between the two. Now, one of the ways of communing with the spirits is via blood. And as I said, we don't need to go far to know that to this day, the idea of vampires, of Dracula, all of that, okay, the blood cult, people do it to this day. So Ramban says, line 17, I accept, and again he mentioned the Rambam in the Moreh Nevukhim, and then he says, V'lo she'yeh ikar tam yisur adam. כי הכתוב מפרש טעמו כי אדם הוא הנפש, כאשר בסדר הקרימות, אבל מזה היו שטופים בו ורדופים אחריו מאוד. So he accepts this idea that this blood cult was really something that attracted people, was part of the idolatrous regime, good thing to fight against it. Nachmanides is not sure that we should believe that this is the ultimate reason, okay? But nevertheless, there is a lot in what Rambam says. Now I'm going to give you a bit of a classical insight here. We're going to read about Tiresias or Ulysses. Let's have somebody read from line 31. Who would like to read? Okay, Brian, we'll have you, please. Line 31.
Sounds like I'd like to read. During the necromantic ceremony,
what is necromancy?
I think when they're a little past their best.
Yes, loving the dead.
Dead.
Okay, so we're getting involved with the dead here in Odyssey. Okay, it's this 11th section. Odysseus, carry on, Brian.
Odysseus slits
line 32.
The throats of 2 sheep and then proceeds to drain their blood into the, I'm afraid my Greek isn't up to it, or pit, which is...
just a second. It's Bothros. Now you know how to describe like a small basin used in a ritual ceremony in ancient Greece. You'd say, please pass the Bothros. Okay? So Bothros is your word. Or a pit. Maimonides said so. Either they have a vessel or they would dig a little ditch, which he has
dug into the ground.
Odysseus 11:35 to 36. At this point in the ceremony,
the dead swarm up from the underworld, displaying an innate attraction to the blood. Such is the overwhelming response of the dead that Odysseus must draw his sword in order to hold back the multitudes who clamor to drink the offering.
The multitudes of spirits, okay? They're all waiting to drink the blood.
But Odysseus refuses to allow the dead to approach the blood until Tiresias has drunk the offering and offered a prophecy for the future. After Tiresias has concluded his prophecy for Odysseus, some of the other dead step forward and drink the blood.
Well, Maimonides only had a couple of books. Now, between agriculture, the book of the Sabians, the book of Tom. But if we have access to an entire classical literature, this is just a little bit of bloody stuff. So what Maimonides read, again, and he'll tell us this at the end of this section of the Moreh Nevukhim, he didn't know how people worship the idols, okay? Time he was around in the 11th century, there was very little idolatry going on in the world of the type that the Tanakh would have been concerned with. But from his reading, he reconstructed many things that we now know were certainly very widespread. Tiresias, by the way, is very interesting. Are you ready for a little Greek mythology?
Mm-hmm.
He was the blind prophet of Apollo. Apparently lived for a long time in Thebes, and he's the first sex change. According to Greek mythology, was walking along, he saw 2 snakes copulating, he took his stick, he killed them, and Hera, who was very fond of snakes, she was of course had a dalliance with Zeus, decided she was going to change him into a woman as a punishment. Well, he became a woman, and he became a priestess of Hera, married and had children, including Mantic, who had the gift of prophecy. Okay. Anyhow, a long story with nymphs and snakes, but eventually his sex change was changed back. And he became a man again because he was nice to a snake. Okay, so Hera lifted the spell. Well, you know, there are all sorts of stories about why he was blind. He was blind because apparently he came across Athena bathing naked. And of course, a goddess doesn't like humans looking at her naked, so she made him blind. On the other hand, his mother, a mythological character, says, shame that you're blind, I'm going to give you fabulous ears. So his hearing became fantastical, and he also achieved this gift of prophecy, but it was given in a very interesting way, that he would never tell the whole truth of what he saw. And this, of course, is the Greeks placing upon their own beliefs the excuse for the omens or the prophecies not necessarily always working, because you always have to have a fallback. And I'm being out of line, but I'm saying lahavdil elef havdalot. Somebody, Rahman al-Islam, is suffering, goes to see a Kabbalist somewhere and does something, and unfortunately the person dies. Now, answer will always be, well, you didn't have enough kavanah, or you took the red strap off or thread off one, or whatever it is, okay? There'll always be a reason. So the Greeks cover themselves too, but Tiresias is the ultimate oracle, okay? And he appears both in Odysseus, as we've just seen. He also appears in Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. Remember Oedipus Rex? King of Thebes calls upon Tiresias to aid in the investigation of the killing of the previous king Laius. Tiresias won't give a straight answer, but then he reveals that it was Oedipus himself who committed the crime. Correct, Bernard? Oedipus himself killed his father. Tiresias is always involved. He also appears in probably what is Sophocles' most famous play. If I was to ask you what is Sophocles' most famous play, beginning with an A, what would you say?
Antigone.
Antigone, and he's there. Creon doesn't allow Polynices to be buried. His niece Antigone defies the order in his court. Creon decrees that she's to be buried alive. Gods express their disapproval of Creon's decision through Tiresias. And what does he say to Creon? The city is sick through your fault. There'll be a plague. Plagues always come in. So this is a little bit about Tiresias, and shows how accurate Rambam actually is when he does cite all this stuff. So if somebody asks you the first sex change in human history, it actually is Greek mythology. Tiresias. 7 years. He went from a man to being a woman, but then he went back. But that, of course, is what mythology can do. All right. So having done all of that, I think I've done enough blood. And let's sort of just wrap up our Ta'amei HaMitzvot, okay? 13th class. Brian, since you started, finish off. Line 41, 13th class.
13th class, part 3, chapter 48, the dietary laws.
Okay, so what's Rambam's take on the dietary laws? Well, Rambam says that dietary laws are there to protect us from unhygienic, unhealthy food, okay? It's that the nutrition is the problem here. For example, pigs are too wet, moist. Their flesh is too moist. We're Aristotelians, remember? And also, they are disgusting because they wallow in filth, okay? And Rambam says, look, we don't want filth in the Jewish religion. The Torah says you have to keep your military camp clean. No filth, no refuse, no human waste. V'yateti elecha al azenecha. okay, and you shall cover up et seatecha. How much more inside the cities and the country in general? Keep it clean. Pigs bring filth. Now, line 4, reading from the beginning. If we were allowed to eat pig, our homes and streets, they would be dirtier than a latrine. Just like the French. To this day, 12th century France. There are you French people wallowing in filth because you eat pig meat. Now, of course, this is all true, by the way. The cities of the Franks. Remember, Rambam worked for Al-Fadl. Al-Fadl was one of the 17 sons of Saladin. Saladin fought the Crusaders. Crusaders came to the Middle East, and their way of living was absolutely filthy, dirty compared to the Muslims at the time. They bathed, they were clean, they had medicine, they had nutrition. In the 12th century, Western Europe was a real cesspool, okay? And this is what the Rambam is expressing in his time. And he says, they eat pig. Of course, Jews and Muslims, amongst whom he lived, would never touch a pig, okay? So all of this comes together. The reason and the external situation in his time, okay? V'chen chelev hakerev masbia u'mafsid ha'ikul. Rambam says, as a doctor, the fat inside the stomach, inside the innards, difficult to digest, it's not nutritious, and we know that the treifa is beginning of the nevela. A treifa animal will die within 12 months. It's probably carrying a disease. A nevela definitely is a disease because it died without shchita. Stay away from all this meat. It's not good. Okay? Tam gidan ashekatuv omnam tam eve melachai hu heoto makne. Now, but we don't tear a limb from a living creature because that makes us cruel. Rambam is definitely all for that. I found this actually because nobody mentions it, but I found this in Masechet Nedarim. It's a whole sugya there. I'm not going to bore you with it, but apparently Nebuchadnezzar ate a rabbit live, bit off its head, swallowed it. Okay, and Tzidkiyahu saw him and was going to tell the tale. It was a disgusting thing. And then Nebuchadnezzar made him take an oath. You can look up the Gemara if you want, okay? But by the way, in the Syrian army, a few years ago, they were training the soldiers to bite off heads of mice live and eat them. That apparently is an ancient Middle Eastern. I hope that you're all after dinner, by the way. Okay.
Very much so.
Good, excellent. Not me. I still have to have mine. But I think I'm inured by now. Ritzoni Lomar, and also Avodah Zarah comes in here. Shayu chotchim min habeima eivar yadua vochlim oto. Now, there's a Mishnah in Avodah Zarah that talks about orot levovin. There's hides of animals whose hearts were taken out. And this was definitely Avodah Zarah. Here I'm going to go west. Aztecs, Incas, Mayas.
Yeah, they did.
Taking the hearts out, remember?
Yeah.
Was very important, a part of their cults. So the Mishnah also refers to this obliquely. If you want to read the Mishnah, you know, okay. Now, how about meat and milk? That also is type of very thick and not that, lean. And the Rambam says, I suspect, and here too it is Avodah Zarah. So here he balances between the dietetics and the idolatrous. And he says, I think it's a combination of both. I think this was a festive meal. Take a kid, small goat, roast it, boil it in its mother's milk. Why do I think that, says Rambam? And Jean, you'll have to validate this. וממה שמחזק זה אצלי, זכור התורה אותו 2 פעמים תחילה, מה שציוותה עליו עם מצוות החג. 3 פעמים בשנה וגומר. We're going to read this in Chol Hamoed Pesach as well. לא תבשל גידי בחלב אמו. Twice in the Torah, it goes 3 times.
It's Isa.
It's next to the Shalosh Regalim.
It's
So
Isa.
therefore Rambam says on the Regalim, on the festivals, I don't want you to do what the idolaters do. That is to take a little goat and boil it in its mother's milk. So here again, the Rambam is on the lookout. Wherever he can, he finds a link. And even if he doesn't find it in the books, and he says so as much, look at line 16. זהו אתה מחזק אצלי בעניין איסורו, ואומנם לא ראיתי זה כתוב. I believe idolatry is the main reason. I haven't seen this written, but I didn't find it in the books of the Sabians. ואומנם מצווה, but I think that it is right. And by the way, Casuto, right? Rabbi Dr. Casuto shows that in Ugaritic literature, the time of the Tanakh, the drinking or eating a kid boiled in its mother's milk was an idolatrous ceremony, was performed on feast and festival days in the temples of the pagans. So the Rambam is very astute here, okay? He has an eye for idolatry. It's very sharp indeed. It's all over the place. But as in relation to Eivar min achai, don't tear a limb from a living animal, there's a moral aspect here too. When you do eat meat, you have to do it in such a way that there's the least suffering caused to the animal. So we have to have a method of shchita that is merciful, okay? And we have to have, and then of course he says something nice, if you like. 20. וכן עשה לשחוט אותו ואת בנו ביום אחד.
But I just want to tell you that
Vicky, can you mute everybody, please?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. And so Rambam explains the pasuk that you may not slaughter the young before its mother's eyes. Okay? And then he says, En hefresh, ben sar ha'adam alav v'tsar she'ar balei chayim, כי אהבת האם רחמי הלבלד אינו נמשך אחר השכל, רק אחרי פועל הכוח המדמה. The Rambam again would not say that an animal has a nefesh, but he does have this imaginative capacity, okay, a very lowly type of emotion. And we share that, and that's just the same with us people. This is also the reason for sending away the mother bird before you take the efrochim, or the beitzim, the young or the eggs. And then he gives us a little drasha. The Torah is concerned not to cause suffering to animals and birds. How much more should you not cause suffering to your fellow human beings? Now the Rambam raises a question which, of course, you would have raised anyhow. We remember the famous Mishnah in Brachot. What does the Mishnah in Brachot say? It says, "Haomer al kan sipor yagiu rachamecha v'gomer." Somebody who says, God's mercies extend even to a bird, that person who says that as chazan has to be thrown off the bima straight away. Correct? Jean, is that correct? Exactly. It is correct. So, question is, what does the Rambam do with a Mishnah Mufureshet, a Mufurish Mishnah, which thus state that whoever says something like that, who imputes mercy as God's reason for his commandments, is an apikoros, is a kaifa, and has to be thrown off the bima and sent out of the Jewish community into Cherem. So Rambam says, and now don't attack me, okay? This reflects the view of one school of thought. It's an Agadah. רצוני לומר דעת מי שחושב שאין טעם לתורה אלא רצון לבד. We remember we learned this. There are the there are the Asherites who believed that everything is simply divine will. There's no point in asking why, wherefore, there's no reason. So if you're an Asherite, then this is your Mishnah. And they were, as he says, criticizing Rasat and Yehuda Levi. There are Asherites in the Talmud as well. So that's their view, okay? We follow the second view. Whoops, okay. We mentioned Kisui Hadam, and I'm just going to finish this off. That, of course, is to make us less keen on gorging ourselves with meat, okay, so we cover up the blood. And then he talks about Nizirut, the Nazirite his wine. As I said, he had a problem with his client, Al-Fadl, who was one of Saladin's 17 sons, and was given a bit of the empire, and then was always fighting with his other siblings and wasn't very good at running the country, Egypt. He was an alcoholic, and Rambam writes to him about the dangers of drink. Muslim, not Muslim, okay? He was a drunkard, and he was the wazir. Rambam says, of course, temperance, moderation, very important. So those are the dietary laws. Laws pertaining to sexual unions. Here I'm going to just tell you about what it says until we talk about Brit Milah. Rambam gives the following reason for sexual laws. Why should you not commit adultery? Why do we not want people to be promiscuous? He says family solidarity. We need families. How do human beings flourish? They have a support group. That support group is called a family. In an agrarian society, you need a family. Otherwise, and therefore in the feudal system, if a knight got killed, then the fiefdom went back to the king because the widow and orphans couldn't take care of it. So you need a family. You need family support. And if you have promiscuity, you don't know who's who, you cannot identify the family. Remember, at the end of the day, when you need someone, you have a claim to your family. Blood is thicker than water. And even though you might not like your family, and they might not like you, when it comes to family enterprises, sometimes that's all you have, and sometimes they actually come through. He also says that if there was promiscuity, the men in the family would be fighting over the women all the time, and then you'd have mayhem and chaos instead of an orderly family life. Then he says, but of course, divorce should be orderly. He says that the sotah is a deterrent against promiscuity. And the woman doesn't want to be publicly shamed by having her hair exposed and part of her body exposed. And therefore, you're going to prevent women being unfaithful. The men will not be promiscuous because they're forbidden to all sorts of women and will have good, solid family life. And apple pie. No slandering wives to get rid of the mohar. Motzi Shemra, Mefateh. Many men would try and get rid of their wives because they wanted to get rid of them without divorcing them. If you divorce them, it wasn't their fault. You had to pay back the gifts and the mohar. So they will often say, the wife was flawed, blemished. Well, you can't do that. Has to go to court and they will establish what actually happened. Incest. Why is incest forbidden? Because it would be too tempting to spend your life in sex if every member of your family was permitted to you. So in families, we're always surrounded by women. And if you felt that way, then you could be driven by a sexual drive of intercourse with all the women around you, all of the women in your family. So therefore, Vayikra chapter 18, incest, forbidden. There's no, Rambam also finds, and we don't have time to read this, but you can, basis in the Torah to prohibit pornography because it leads you to engage in sexual acts. Finally, circumcision. Now this is interesting. Line 29. Circumcision dampens the sexual drive. וכבר חשבו שזאת המילה היא השלמת חסרון יצירה, ומצא כל חולק מקום
Yeah.
לחוק לומר איך יהיו הדברים הטבעיים חסרים עד שיצטרכו השלמה מחוץ. Of course, the attack on circumcision has always come from nature. Why are you mutilating people? Why are you defacing nature? אם שהתפעל מתועלת האור ההוא לאיבר ההוא, ולא ניתנה מצווה זו להשלים חיסרון הבריאה, רק להשלים חיסרון המידות. Rambam has no problem. I would rather be perfectly virtuous than perfectly natural. So I don't need to have the foreskin, maybe perfect nature. It's much more important to be able to control your carnal desires, and therefore we circumcise. והנזק ההוא הגופני המגיע לאיבר ההוא הוא המכוון שלא יפסד בו דבר מן הפעולות שבהם עמידת האיש לא תבטל בעבורה ההולדה, אבל תחסר בה התאווה היתרה. A man who is circumcised can bring children into the world. There's no problem with sexual life, only he will not fall off into excess sexual drive and carnality. And that is a good thing, okay? Now, the Rambam, by the way, in Mishneh Torah, he puts Milah in Sefer Ahava. I pointed out that to you last time, and I also pointed out the reason why. And then he also talks about the fact that Brit Milah creates solidarity between Jews. We know who our co-religionists are, and then he goes on to say all sorts of things about the medical benefits of having circumcision early on, okay? And he also says, not only is the child basically immune to the pain, he says the parents, this is line 1 on page 5, parents, if they see a kid with whom they've had a relationship subject to an operation of that sort, they become emotionally upset. Whereas a small baby, they'll say it's a little nip and they won't be so involved. Rambam is a psychologist as well as being every other thing, and therefore he says it'll be easier to do it in 8 days, and it's the wisdom of the Torah. And medically speaking, he says, no question, much better to do it in 8 days than any time afterwards. And the mamzer is there to act as a deterrent to promiscuity. 2 people can decide to sin, adulterers. They believe in hell, they'll go and burn in hell. But remember that in the pre-contraception era, if you were promiscuous and you produced a child would be a mamzer, the stigma would be visited on the innocent child and all the descendants of that child. That's a major responsibility that even if you are very passionately and sexually involved with someone might stop you going, as it were, the whole hog, because why should you bring a mamzer into the world? Okay, so I'm now going to finish off the Moreh Nevukhim course, as it were, the Shiurim we've had, all 28, okay? And I'm just going to read, do I have time? I do. The last section from line 10 until the end, okay? בכל מה שנעלם טעמו מרוב החוקים, אינו רק להרחיק מעבודה זרה. There are some things that we do not know the reasons for. Now, it may not necessarily be to keep us afar from idolatry. ואלו הפרטים אשר נעלם ממני טעמם ולא ידעתי תועלתם. And there are also aspects of idolatry that I do not know, and therefore I cannot account for all of the mitzvot. Now he says something interesting. He says, "Hu mipnei she'ena dvarim hanishma'im ki dvarim hanirim la'ayin." He says, what you read in a book isn't as vivid as what you see with your eye. So, ובעבור זה אין זה השיעור אשר ידעתי אני מדעות הצבא, ממה ששמעתי מן הספרים כמו שידע אותו מי שראה מעשיהם הגלויים. I use idolatry to explain a lot of the mitzvot, but I don't really know idolatry. I didn't live in an idolatrous society. And I'm only reconstructing from what I read. So therefore, I know far less. And we know, of course, that that's true. It was only in the 19th century that Western Europeans began to understand what ancient idolatry, Egypt, Sumer, Assyria was actually all about. Okay? So you would have had to be there and seen it. I wasn't. But I still think I've learned enough from my books to provide quite good reasons. Okay, Yamach Shemo. They disappeared. We're talking about going back 1,000 years, 2,000 years. So I'm reconstructing. ואילו ידענו פרטי המעשים ההם ושמענו חלקי אותם הדעות, היה מתבהר לנו הטעם ואופני החוכמה בחלקי מעשי הקורבנות והתרומות וזולתם. Things that probably are directed to combating idolatry. Sacrifices, Torah v'Tara. If we really knew idolatry writ large, then we will understand the reasons for all of these laws. Okay? ממה שלא ידעתי תמו, אבל אין לי ספק בזה כי הכל היה that a major reason for the mitzvot of the Torah is to do away with idolatrous practices. Now he cites psukim in Yirmiyahu, and he says that the problem with idolatry is that it is vain, foolish, irrational, and you lead a life of vanity. And remember, in his letter to astrology, he said, why did the first Bet HaMikdash fall? Why did Jerusalem fall to the Babylonians? Because Israelites were looking to Hovrei Shamayim, to find out what was going to happen in the battle with the Babylonians from astrology and from omens and from blood, instead of making weapons and learning how to fight. So I leave you with Maimonides, the rationalist, the historicist, the contextualist, okay, the big view of rationality in terms of understanding Torah. Hinei zakarti pertei mitzvot kulam asher kalal otam ze haklal v'ha'iroti al ta'ama. I've given you all the mitzvot, and I've given you reasons. I've suggested reasons. Lo nishar mehem davar shelo natati botam rak chalakim ma'atim. Only a few I haven't given reasons for. Af al pi shal derech ha'emet v'natati gam bahem tam. A Rambam leaves us with an enigmatic statement, as it always does. But actually, you know, I mightn't have written the reason, but if you really read me carefully, I have. May we have the intellectual capacity to realize the potential of what we have written, says Rambam. Now, people, it's up to you. If you have it, you will discover the reasons for everything. But if you are not at that level, I'm sorry, you'll just have to go around with a little cloud of ignorance. So I'm stopping the share. This is our end of the reading of the text of the Moreh Nevukhim. And I'm going to say a couple of things now in the last 4 or 5 minutes. Again, in an answer to Jean, but probably an answer to a question that has been on all of our minds. How do we reconcile the Rambam of the Mishneh Torah, the halachist par excellence in every area of Jewish law? Rabbi Yosef Karo only wrote on practical halakha. The Mishnah Brura is on what we practice. Rambam wrote equally well on every single aspect of Jewish law. Torah Sheba'al Peh. And he says things that apparently contradict what he says in the Moreh Nevukhim. So it's a type of schizophrenia almost. Well, first of all, I'm going to say, mark this. Rambam rationally is committed to a legal system. He says if you want to become perfect, you need to have a society that works. There has to be peace, there has to be security. There also have to be people who are kind to each other. Remember his description of prophecy. Now, in order to have a legal system, you must have a system which is respected, and there's nothing like a God-given system that goes back a long time. And then there must be a system that is binding. If you decide to chip away at the system throw out a bit here and a bit there, then there's no legal system. And then your society will never be able to become a sufficiently healthy society for people to begin their paths to prophecy. Now, I could give a whole series of shiurim on that. The Rambam is interested in the structure of a legal system as much as he's interested in its details. And therefore, when you consider the reasons for the commandments, you're engaging in speculation that doesn't bear upon the validity of the halakha, which is a given. The thing about Rambam, as opposed to Mendelssohn saying, that Rambam practiced halakha, believed in halakha, would not for a minute imagine not keeping every jot and tittle of halakha, and that halakha is connected with his theology. Okay? So, first thing is that Rambam is able to be a halachist because of respect for the law. His reasons are there to make the law more rational, but they do not replace the norms, the directives of the law. And unless we have a binding legal system, we are lost, absolutely lost. Then everything will degenerate into chaos. Now, Rambam fights. The second thing is that his Moreh Nevukhim can also be understood as a battle against superstition in every form, even if it comes dressed up in I should be careful here, in very religious garb, okay? It's still superstition. And he was passionate about the fight. Remember his explanation of Tumah and Tahara? It is as anti-superstitious as you can possibly imagine. And this is Rambam's great crusade, if I can use that term, to try and purify Judaism of those things that make it irrational. And therefore he says, look, you have to keep halakha. There's no question. This is the way we live. This is what prevents us descending into chaos. But I can explain this to you in a way that will make it palatable to you to understand how the halakha got there. But you still have to keep it. And in relation to superstition, he says, let us try and have a non-superstitious religion. When you kiss your mezuzah, do not think it's going to save your life. And if a tragedy happens, do not check your mezuzah. Rehearse constantly the idea that there are people around me who might think so. I will have a mezuzah, but I will never believe that the mezuzah is a charm. I will know that it's there to instruct me because of the words inside the parchment about the unity of God, God's perfection, and the true nature of a relationship with the divine. And finally, Rambam begins and ends with the combination of Yidiyah and Ahava. He wants to tell us that Ahava is the result of Yidiyah. And most religious and many religious people feel going to shul, do the stuff, love God, enjoy the experience, and that's it. No, you've got it wrong. As human beings, we have to answer to the best potential we have, which is to begin with Yidiyah. And then when we have the Yidiyah, we achieve an Ahava, which is much purer and far superior to the one that begins and ends with some kind of simplistic love of God. So I give you Maimonides, Guide for the Perplexed, and whatever you want to make of it, you can. Remember his words of warning at the very beginning. Don't read me if you're happy with where you are. But we have done a little reading. You can stay where you are, okay? He's not around to check on us. And next week in Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll talk about the what happened, reactions to the Moreh Nevukhim, the ups and downs of the guide, and I'm going to connect it with Chassidut, believe it or not, and Kabbalah. So, comments, questions, or just good night? Jean. Unmute. You're muted. You're muted.
Yes.
Ah, great. Okay.
But you said at the last moment, no. I remember according to the Talmud, what is hoped is that you are yirato kodemet lechochmato. Apparently, Rambam seems to prefer chochmato kodemet yirato.
Definitely has yidiyah before ahava. Didn't say yira.
Hava is a
Yira.
stage later than yira.
Exactly. So Rambam only, I said yidiyah and ahava. Rambam talks about yirat Hashem. He says unless you have an ethical, moral way of living, you'll never get close. Okay, but that's one of the preparatory steps. And because even those who say yirat kodemet, they talk about chokhmah, yivanit. I mean, they are whatever it is. Rambam would agree yirat shamayim, definitely. But when you talk about ahava, okay, then ahava is yidiyah. Okay, I think it is a very good night to everybody. Besarot tovot, Yeshuot, and Nechamot, and we will all be well. Convene next week, last session before Pesach, last bit about the Rambam's Moreh before we move on to something entirely different in Yetz Hashem. Okay, that's it, folks. Bye for now.
Thank you.